Hello my friends and welcome back. Thank you very much for being with me again today. Sometimes we have to figure things out from another person's speech by trying to understand his euphemisms, and sometimes his terms mean something else that they regularly mean. In this case, in articles that I read, they sometimes tell you, they put a title over there and then you try to figure out what's going on in the article and you don't find almost anything. Then you read other articles unrelated to that article and you receive answers that were not given in that specific article that supposedly was talking about the answers you wanted. So because the articles are written by other individuals, they do not know what those guys said and this guy didn't say. So sometimes you find information in unrelated articles regarding issues that were supposed to be revealed in that one. Also, they use euphemisms and they use certain kind of terms that you have to figure out what exactly they refer to. In this case, related to this article that I'm going to read now, the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian mass media, which I usually use, they talk about, when they talk about the developments in Ukraine, how things are going, and they talk about the Russian army and what they do. Whenever they do not refer to the Russians as using tanks, you have to understand that these guys are not advancing in those areas. When the Ukrainians are telling you that the Russians used tanks, you should understand that that's an offensive, most likely. I figured this out because, for instance, in this case, as in others in the past, while I was reading their, statements, and they didn't tell me if it's the Russians are in an offensive or a defensive mode, I realized by observing a pattern that when they use, the Russians use tube artillery and use this and S-300 and so on, and tanks. Whenever they name tanks, that means the Russians are most likely advancing over there or trying to complete an offensive, to start an offensive, or they're in full swing. I could identify this in this article of today when they purposely or directly call it offensive, and the exact areas that I could figure it out just by the Ukrainians using the word tanks in relation to that particular acts. In this case, there are three where the Russians are advancing, or at least trying to advance, according to the Ukrainians. So this article comes from Ukrinform. It is from today, the 7th of November 2022. This is the title. Enemy goes on offensive in 3 directions. Ukrainian troops repel 8 attacks. So I have never seen this, I haven't seen this lately with the Russians going to an offensive. I had to figure it out from whatever their double speech and use in their articles. And I understand them because it's a war and I don't want to, praise the enemy's successes, obviously, and they try to minimize their losses and maximize the enemy's losses, or minimize the enemy's successes and maximize their successes. The enemy goes on the offensive in Bakhmut, Adviidka and Novopavlinvka. This is the first time when I see offensive again. I knew Bakhmut and Adviidka, but Novopavlinvka came later. So the units of the defense forces repelled the occupators' attacks in the areas of Yampil, Andriivka, Krasnohorivka, Marinka, Pavlivka, Vodiane, Novoyakilivka and Donetsk region, and Bilohorivka and in Luhansk region. So in Luhansk and Donetsk, they repelled the occupiers' attacks. That means they are attacking there. They're not, how do you repel them? That means they're trying to move and you block them and push them back. I don't think it's just rockets and you just rockets back. That's not repelling of anything. How do you repel that? So you repel an attack. An attack is like, oh, let's go, brrr, go forward. This is stated in the report of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine as of 6 o'clock a.m. November 7th. Over the past day, the enemy launched 4 missile strikes, 24 airstrikes, more than 55 MLRS attacks. The enemy in the areas of 30 settlements in Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Luhansk, Mykolaiv, Sumy and Kherson regions hit the 30 settlements. In Volyn and Polisia directions, the situation has not changed significantly. The enemy opened fire in other directions. In Siversky direction, mortars, tubes and rocket artillery were fired. No tanks, remember. And then he says, in Sumy region. In addition, the occupier used combat drones. In Slobozansky direction, tanks and the entire range of artillery were fired on the areas of, and give you about 7 settlements. Then in Kupiansk and Liman directions, artilleries of various types was fired on the areas of, it gives you about 7 areas. Again, no tanks. In Bakhmut direction, tanks, mortars, tube and rocket artillery were fired on the areas of Adviidka, Soledar, Yakohon, Bakhmutske. So they give you here tanks. And then we go to the next one. In Adviidka directions, tanks and artillery were fired on the areas of, again, tanks. In Novopavlinvka and Zaporozhye directions, mortars, tubes and rocket artillery were fired on the areas of Huliapole. They didn't mention tanks here. In southern Bukh directions, tanks and artillery of various types were fired on the areas. They fired. A tank is something that is mobile, right? And cover land. Otherwise you would have just a regular cannon fixed and do it. So it moves and you do it for offensive purposes, not only to change, oh, I'm going to move here, I'm going to shoot from here, I'm going to move here, I'm going to shoot. That's one thing, but that's purposely to go forward, to attack. That's why it's like as it is. And it's with all those, wheels and whatever they have. So in southern Bukh direction, tanks and artillery of various types were fired. And it says, in addition, the enemy continued to conduct aerial reconnaissance actively using UAVs. More than 20 sorties were made. The Russian occupation forces continued to grossly violate the laws of and customs of war. The Russians continue looking for subversive groups and spotters in Kakovka settlements of Kherson region. Detainees are taken to the Hormostavika and forced to sell, let's see, where is this? Self-incriminate under torture. Similar measures are taking place in Borivske and settlements in Luhansk region. Mass searches, seizures of mobile phones, abduction of people. In Kherson, the occupiers, disguised in civilian clothes, occupied the premises of civilians and strengthened positions inside for conducting street battles. At the same time, Russian propagandist journalists planned to shoot a report in the city about the alleged extermination of civilian population by the defense forces of Ukraine. I don't see that impossible. That's what people do in this kind of situation when they are able to come with a front. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to look for informants, people who cooperated with the other administration, traitors obviously seen by then, and they're going to, what do you think they're going to do? There are people that will say, nobody will see me if I shoot this guy here. Who's going to know? It's just me and this guy. I found him dead. I mean, there's so many. Just to read historical books, not historical books, history books, and you find of this many incidents happening everywhere where people look around and say, well, besides they're angry, they're hateful right at this point, big time, right? Do you think they're going to be okay, Geneva Convention right here? I doubt that. Why I doubt that? Because they're human. And when you're under so much pressure for so long, and at the same time propagandized by your sources as well, it's impossible to keep your cool and how should I put it, your training, your self-respect. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying is most likely what happens here. It really happens with going around and just blazing people up. According to the updated information, the enemy losses of the previous days were confirmed. In Novopavlinvka, Donetsk region, an attack was launched on the cluster of enemy equipment. 5 combat vehicles destroyed, 4 more were damaged. In the area of Mayorsk, the daily enemy losses, this is so small written here, I can't even, and if I make it bigger, it just loses the size. The daily, no complaints. I just did. The enemy losses are up to 30 people killed and more than 120 wounded. In Lishansk, a unit of Bakhmut battalion was struck. More than 30 invaders were killed and up to 15 were wounded. The enemy carefully conceals the real number of casualties. You all do. Over the past day, Ukraine's air forces struck the enemy 22 times, hitting 20 areas of enemy personnel, weapons and military equipment clusters, as well as 2 air defense positions. The air defense units shot down 5 enemy UAVs. Ukraine's missile and artillery units hit 2 command posts, 8 areas of manpower, weapons, and shot down 5 enemy UAVs. Ukraine's missile and artillery units hit 2 command posts, 8 areas of manpower. These guys are hitting everything. Military equipment cluster, ammunition depot, an electronic warfare station, and other important military objects of the enemy. So it seems like in the day of the Lord, Sunday, right? These guys continued the more ferocious fights that they do during the week. But hey, I don't know if they really care. But this article, so we get out of this, these guys are still fighting like crazy. The Russians are in an offensive in at least 3 directions, and Novopavlinvka, Adviidka, and the other one was, I can't remember it right now, but let me find it. And of course Bakhmut, how did I forget that one? That was usually the first one. I was too focused on Novopavlinvka to mention. Okay, so the Ukrainians obviously report a lot of damages caused to the Russians, and I have no doubt that occurred. I will keep you posted with new developments in the next videos. Thank you very much for being with me again today. Stay strong, stay smart, look for the truth, and be just.